Welcome to the Screen the Screener College Basketball Podcast with your hosts, Mike Randall and Gus Kearns.
Welcome in, listeners, to the Screen the Screener College Basketball Podcast, where we're always talking everything college hoops. You could have been anywhere else on the dial, but you chose to be here with us, Mike and Gus, and we appreciate that. And we're going to continue the team preview series for the upcoming college basketball season, and we brought in an expert from the Testudo Times. We brought in Sam Oshtry. Sam, thank you so much for giving us some time and catching us up on everything Maryland Terrapins.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to do this.
I can't wait for the season to get here. All right, so don't forget to give Sam a follow over at SOSHTRY, and you can follow Testudo Times, obviously, at Testudo Times on the Twitter machine and testudotimes.com, of course. Sam, let's get into this. Last year, Maryland punches another ticket. They get another win in the NCAA tournament after being 10-10 in February, and that is definitely something to celebrate. Can you identify a turning point or a singular moment for this Maryland team last season that we can highlight?
Yeah, so that team clearly exceeded all expectations. I mean, that was a team that struggled early on in the year in a tough Big Ten conference. They should not have even made the tournament at one point, let alone win one game, but they did. So they exceeded expectations. And it was a team that was really out of whack in terms of the positions. I mean, they didn't have the legitimate center. So Dante Scott, who's not a center, he can play on the perimeter, but he's more of a forward. He was playing their center role. Eric Ayala was assuming the ball handling duties as a point guard, but that's not really his natural position. But so when I look at a point in time where they really made that switch, it was Eric Ayala was running a lot of point guard early on in the year. He goes out for 2 games in mid-January, and Hakim Hart, who's the shooting guard, plays some small forward, he starts getting those point guard duties and playing more of the bringing up the ball and initiating the offense. They started initiating the offense much quicker than they were in the past, and that they were stale all year, and that just allowed them to open up, play more free. And that was really the point, because when Ayala came back, he was playing more off the ball, and he's a much better scorer off the ball. He flourished as an off-the-ball scorer. And then also they went on a 5-game winning streak towards the end of that season. Against 2 games against Nebraska they won, Minnesota, Rutgers, Michigan State they beat. So, I mean, they had some good wins, and they were just able to rally together. But that was a team that was defensive-oriented. I mean, they were really tough on defense, led by Darren Morcell, who now transferred. He's at Marquette now. They were a struggling offensive team, but they somehow rallied together. And Mark Turgeon, that might have been his best coaching performance since he's been here.
Wow, that's saying something too, because one of the things that's seemingly a nonstop talking point is Turgeon and hot seat. Those things often come together in the same paragraph. And if you're saying that he exceeded expectations last season with this Terps team, and totally makes sense. All right, you mentioned one of the transfers, and let's talk about the transfers coming in to the program, right? And I think the word jackpot might roll off the lips when we're looking around at who's going to be on your roster this season. Can you provide a quick scout and the type of high-level transfers that the Terps brought in this offseason?
Yeah, so the transfer portal was an absolute blessing for Maryland this year. And with this new transfer rule, and people can immediately become eligible and play the following season, they always talk about the rich get richer. And I guess Maryland is one of those programs with a rich history, and they certainly did. I mean, I talked about earlier, they didn't have a true point guard or a true center, and they filled those roles easily. Qudus Wahab, that's the center that's coming in. He was just named to the Kareem Abdul-Jabbar Top Center of the Year watch list. Andy Katz did a Big Ten top 20 players. He was ranked 15th overall. He's coming from Georgetown. He averaged 12 and 8 last year. And something Maryland has talked about a lot is they want to use him in different ways, bring him out of the basket, develop his 15-foot jumper. So he's not just a back to the basket player, but also with him is he's a big time defender. I mean, the Big Ten has maybe the best bigs in the country with Kofi Cockburn, Hunter Dickinson with Michigan. I mean, they had no one to defend those guys last year, and he provides that. So that's the true center in Qudus Wahab that comes over. And the other big guy is Fats Russell coming from. He is a dynamic player, explode the dribble, and he had to do a lot of the scoring for Rhode Island, which isn't exactly his role. I mean, he's more of a distributor. He certainly can score, but he's more of a distributor. And with the scoring that Maryland's going to have, he's going to be able to score when he needs to, but also distribute when he needs to. He loves to push the ball, run the fast break. He's very familiar with Dante Scott. They went to high school together. Eric Ayala's been playing basketball with for years. So those are the two big transfers that are immediately going to step into the starting lineup and be huge for this Maryland team. And then two other guys that will get some time off the bench, Ian Martinez from Utah and Xavier Green from Old Dominion. Xavier Green's a tough, experienced basketball player, good defender. Both those guys are going to be energy guys. And this is a really deep Terps team.
And it sounds like they are going to, it sounds like the transfers are going to fit in perfectly to the holes that you talked about and were exposed last season. And if you're playing without a true point guard and a true big, then you're going to play, multiple positional wings, which you guys did pretty well last season. But now that you have some more defined roles, that sounds amazing. And, Fats was a little bit and one mixtape when he was up at Rhode Island. So the fact that he's going to be able to slow it down and not everything's going to be on his shoulders, I think he's going to appreciate his workload lessening, and maybe just taking care of the ball is going to be priority one, which you guys were great at already, averaging amongst the lowest turnovers inside the Big Ten.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and a couple of other guys that might find some time are the talented freshman duo that elected to stay local. Just how impactful will this class be, and who do you think among that class is going to find the floor for meaningful minutes with the stacked lineup that we've already talked about?
Turgeon's been talking about all season about the depth that they have, and these two freshmen aren't going to necessarily get a ton of time in the starting lineup unless there's some injuries, but they are going to play and they're going to contribute to this team. First, it starts with James Graham, who was part of the team for halfway through the season. He was an early enrollee, so he played in a couple games, but he had the grind of the college basketball season for half of the season. He has that down already because he was able to come over as an early enrollee last year. So I mean, that'll certainly help them. He was a 4-star recruit out of high school. He's super athletic, can defend and switch on the multiple positions. So he's going to get some legitimate time and minutes and probably play some good shifts. Another guy is Julian Reese, who's another 4-star. He's going to get some backup center minutes when Qudus Wahab goes down, if he ever gets in foul trouble. He's another guy that's athletic. So those are the two guys I look for. And not only are they going to be playing backup minutes this year, but Turgeon's not just looking for this year, but looking for next year. I mean, they don't have a lot of recruits coming in right now. And when you look at their roster, Ayala, Qudus Wahab, Fats Russell, probably Dante Scott, all those guys are going to be gone next year. And with the transfer portal, it's so hard to tell a year out because you never know what's going to happen with the new transfer portal rules. But this team is going to be looking dramatically different. So he wants to get those freshmen some real playing time experience in big time situations. So even for next year, they're more prepared.
It even sounds like, when they're running the scout team or, if, they're running scrimmage in practice, that scrimmage might be pretty high level. It might get pretty intense.
I was just going to say, I mean, that's what Turgeon talks about all the time is how he can tell how deep they are because all these games are so even in practice. And he's legitimately talking about playing 9 or 10 guys, which is incredibly unlike him. I mean, he really goes 7 or 8 and gets his rotations down tight. And so we'll see if he's telling the truth or not come when the season comes around. But this team has the potential to go 8, 9, 10 deep.
Yeah, he does have that Coach Thibodeau mindset where he's going to play his guys the most minutes and not necessarily run them in the ground, but put that much trust in them. So it'll be interesting to see if he expands that rotation like you're talking about, Sam. We're talking to Sam Oshtry. You can find him on Twitter at SOSHTRY. And Sam, thank you for giving us a little time here. Let's talk about those returning players. We admire Eric Ayala's makeup, his skill set, and you already talked about Hart. I really like his game and his makeup and how versatile he is. The starting unit and the starting core is going to be strong. Talk a little bit about how that high IQ that's returning contributes to that low turnover ratio and just how valuable is that going to be in a league that's stacked with All-Americans and people that are going to get drafted.
Yeah, the Big Ten is an absolute grind. I mean, in the regular season, it's the toughest conference. There's no gimmies. There's no easy wins. It just doesn't exist in the Big Ten, and that was evident last year and really the year before, and we're going to see it this year. So the fact that Dante Scott, Hakim Hart, and Eric Ayala have that experience of playing in the Big Ten, that's going to be incredibly important. And with the returning guys, I mean, it starts with Dante Scott. He's the best player on the team. I said it earlier, but he had to play a lot of out of position as the center last year, which isn't his natural position. He's a forward that can stretch the floor. And he's a legitimate 3-level scorer. And what I mean by that is he can attack the hoop. He can play with his back to the basket. He can pull up for mid-range games, but he also can shoot the 3-ball at a high level. So, I mean, he's the best player on this team. I think the offense runs through him more than anyone. But at the same time, Eric Ayala comes in. He's a dynamic scorer, can get downhill very well for his size, can play the point guard if he needs to because he has experience last year, but prefers playing off the ball. Again, as a shooter, can take people off the dribble. It's a nice handle. And then the big question mark, a lot of people are calling the X factor for this team, is Hakim Hart. And Turgeon was saying all offseason, he's really worked on his body. He's added 15 pounds of muscle. And, you're not sure if you really believe that. But then we were at some practices this year, and he really looks much bigger. I mean, he has completely transformed his body. His mechanics of his shot look different because he was a little bit of a streaky shooter last year. So if he can become a knockdown 3-point shooter and attack the basket as a defender, switch on multiple positions and move his feet well, I mean, he really could be the X factor for this team.
It makes sense because you mentioned the little run that he had as, a ball handler and distributor last season. And his versatility is insane. If you're going to tell me that his shot looked a little bit better, a little bit improved, so he can be a respectable 3-point shooter that people are going to have to close out on, then that just plays into the rest of his skill set. And, you mentioned his body. He's not going to get pushed around anymore as a freshman. He's going to be he's going to be a full-blown Big Ten player. And speaking of the Big Ten, the conference stacked. It's got so many talented big men. It's got top 25 teams and programs that are really desperate for March success. Sam, what might be the matchup that's going to tell the truth about this Terps team inside the Big Ten?
Yeah, so I think it starts with the top of the Big Ten, Michigan and Purdue. Those are the two best teams, and I've put those two teams on the tier of their own because of just the experience they bring back, but also the great recruiting classes. I mean, Hunter Dickinson is returning from Michigan, Eli Brooks, probably the two best players last year, but they also bring in the number one recruiting class in the nation. So, like Michigan, they're one of the best teams in the country, but also one of the best teams, but the best team in the Big Ten. So, Maryland will play at Michigan. They'll only play them once this year, so that'll be a great test for them. And then Purdue brings back a ton of guys too, and Zach Edey, Jaden Ivory, and of course Trevion Williams, who's on everyone's watch list as one of the best players. The offense will run through him. So those two teams, they'll play them once, are at the top of the Big Ten. I also look at Illinois, Ohio State. And I see Maryland around their tier. So when they play them, it'll be a tough test. And then Indiana with Trace Jackson Davis and Mike Brown's first year as head coach. So there's just a ton of tests. Like I said earlier, there's no night off in the Big Ten. You can't look at an opponent, even like Rock. They have a great team this year. They might not be a top 5 or 6 team in the Big Ten, but any night you look at the Big Ten, and the Michigan State's always lurking with Tom Izzo, obviously. So any night in the Big Ten is not a pushover. You can't take a night off. And you would think that prepares you for March. Obviously, there's been a lot of talk about maybe it doesn't, because last year and in recent years, the Big Ten has not had a lot of success in March. But it'll be interesting to see, and this will be another great year in that conference.
Yeah, without question. And I think one of the elements that you kind of touched on there was the March success. And I think if nothing else, it definitely preps the resume in the right way for everybody inside the Big Ten, because you always have an opportunity to grab that quad 1 win or to grab that win on the road. That's really going to change the definition of your profile when the selectors are looking at it. But at the same time, maybe that beating back and forth and everything being a grind, like you're mentioning, leaves a little something to be desired for these teams when they get to March, and maybe some durability issues. Maybe that you might be onto something there. Yeah. And you're right with Michigan and Purdue. I view them how you do, and putting them in that top tier, top 10 teams in the nation. You can attach some Final Four chatter to them and even some national championship chatter to them. So if Maryland is going to, show what they're worth, those are two big tests right there. Sam, let's take a look at the non-conference schedule. What games should we have circled or highlighted or underlined in the non-conference schedule where you think all of these new parts that we have previously talked about, they might mesh, fit, or thrive?
Yeah, you talked about it just there with the Big Ten schedule that they play. It's a resume booster, and it's really a grind that sometimes they wear each other off. So I think this has been a thing in the past, and it's certainly evident this year. Mark Turgeon doesn't love to schedule the toughest non-conference. And I mean, that's for good reason, because they're playing such difficult matchups in the Big Ten week in and week out. So for a resume booster purposes, why would you? The game that I really look at is there's the ACC Big Ten Challenge game. A lot of Maryland fans were hoping that would be against Duke in Duke's Coach K's last year at Duke. It's a little get that rivalry back in his last year. It didn't happen. They're going to be playing Virginia Tech at home. That'll be a good test. And then December 12th, they play Florida at the Barclays Center in Brooklyn. That'll be a good test for them. Those are really their two toughest non-conference opponents. Florida's not a great team, but they are one of the better ones in the SEC. So kind of matching up against an SEC team should be a good test for them. And then also they play in the Bahamas Thanksgiving tournament. They'll start out with Richmond, and then they'll play either Louisville or Mississippi State. If they get that Louisville matchup, I think that's another good ACC test for them. So again, they don't schedule the toughest non-conference, but they do have some worthy opponents that should be great games.
And it's interesting, the approach to the non-conference schedule that you said Coach Turgeon and his staff takes, because they know they're getting into that multi-game grind inside the Big Ten. And maybe that might pay the dividends down the line for this particular program. Instead of loading up on the non-con, having so many high-profile games because of the conference that you're in and the program that you're at. Let's maybe pump the brakes a little bit and make sure our guys are not completely destroyed for Big Ten season. I think that kind of makes sense. All right, so Sam, last thing. We think this Maryland team might be like Sweet 16-ish good. Like, what's the vibe, and just how successful will the Terrapins be this upcoming season? Do you see something further? Is that an appropriate grade? Like, where do you see them after seeing practice a couple times?
Yeah, I have high expectations for this Maryland team. I think it's one of the better teams that we've seen in a long time since maybe that 2019 team, they split the Big Ten regular season. Obviously, COVID took away the Big Ten tournament and the NCAA championship. And everyone loves to talk about that. That could have been a team that really went on a magical run. Who knows? We'll never know. But
right.
This really is one of their better teams in quite some time. So I think Sweet 16 is a reasonable expectation at the minimum. I think this team has the capability to, like, the experience that they have, the mesh, the flow. I mean, you talk about a lot, transfers coming in. You're not sure if they're going to mesh well together, what their chemistry is going to be like. But Hakim Hart, Fats Russell, Dante Scott, and Eric Ayala are all from the Philadelphia area. And Eric Ayala is from Delaware, which isn't too far by. So these guys have been playing basketball together for years. I mean, like almost a decade now. A lot of them, the AAU games, they play pickup all summer. So they have a ton of chemistry. It is one of the strengths of this team, that Turgeon chemistry. So when you talk about a prediction, I think that they're very capable of going past the Sweet 16, maybe even the Elite Eight. I think they're going to finish top 4 in the Big Ten this year. In the regular season, we'll see how the tournament plays out.
Right.
Mark Turgeon the other day, he was like, I've been a blessed guy my whole life. I haven't really made a tournament run, but eventually I'm going to be blessed enough to make it, which is kind of funny to say. And maybe it is, because he hasn't lived up to the expectations of the Maryland fan base in the tournament. So maybe this is the year that he can finally do it, because this is one of his better, well put together teams in quite some time. So it might be a little bit of a overreaction, not reaction, but I think they can go to the Elite Eight.
I think you just made the days of many Maryland fans listening to the podcast. And we're talking with Sam Oshtry. He's from the Testudo Times. Please follow his work over at testudotimes.com, and please give him a follow over at SOSHTRY to follow all of your Maryland Terrapin information. Sam, thank you so much for breaking it down for us, catching us up, and talking about the Big Ten and, of course, Maryland a little bit. Totally appreciate it, man.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
If you enjoy the kind, in-the-know, knowledgeable guests like Sam on the pod, please give the podcast a follow on Twitter at SDS Podcast, efficiency of keystrokes, of course. And don't be afraid to spread a little kindness and leave a kind review. And leave a kind review for the knowledgeable people like Sam that we've had on the podcast to get you ready for college basketball season. Cheers, Cilantro, Gratulati, everybody. Arigato.